Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Things Policy podcast. So, this is Avinash, Shet, a research analyst from the Takshashila Institution. Today, I have with me my colleague Anisree Suresh, who is also a research analyst at Takshashila Institution. Hello, Anisree, and thanks for sharing out some time for us in this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Avinash. Really looking forward to the conversation.
So, folks, in this episode, we are going to talk about trade of essential goods. More specifically, exports of these essential goods. Well, import-export are not simple processes, right? And a recent news, where Union government withdrew the minimum export price for basmati rice and onion, that sparked my interest. And hence, I invited Anisree to explain me all about it, and to understand the nature of such trade. So, Anisree, you are an economist. So, what do you make out of this news? While we, talk about this, you can also enlighten us with this concept of minimum export pricing and essential goods.
Sure. Avinash, it's a very interesting news and it's a very interesting economic policy tool if you really want to look at it. So, the policymakers in India have constantly endeavored to promote agricultural exports. However, certain agricultural products have been subject to extensive use of export restrictions as well. So, like the story of onion and basmati is quite interesting for mainly two reasons. One is it kind of dictates the country's political economy by continuing to be an election agenda. And the second aspect is that it also kind of decides how India's global trade status is changing and how we position in the agri value chains and global food security and all those things. So the recent decision by the union government to lift the minimum export price on these product raises one crucial question that we have to decode through this conversation, right? Whether what is this minimum export price or MEP, and what is its role in our economy and all those things, right? So basically what we have to understand before we get into this conversation is that the objective of the policy is to basically provide that domestic food security and stabilize the prices. Also, at the time, most of these policies and all these things try to boost agriculture. So by removing minimum export price, by that government is basically trying to boost the agricultural exports. So I think all of this conversation we can try to analyze better about it, but the basic aspect is that MEP, the minimum export price, is ultimately a redundant policy tool that kind of has been harming small farmers, distorting trade, and it fails to control the domestic food inflation also, although that was the objective of it was stated.
Okay, so it was the whole consequences was against what it was supposed to protect.
Yeah.
Okay, so just to understand about this policy, is this policy something unique to India? I mean, is this something do happen globally as well for these kind of essential goods or even non-essential goods?
Yeah. So actually, I think especially after the 2007, 2008 crisis and all those things, there has been a dramatic increases in the commodity prices, if you look at it globally, right? And which led many of the countries to impose export restrictions in an attempt to ensure domestic food security. So such export restrictions in turn led to further price increases by placing limits on global supply and undermining the level of buyer confidence and all those things. So all export restrictions in the long as well as the short run lead to a deterioration of welfare in both the country imposing such measures as well as the rest of the world. So there has been a lot of measures even if you look at the world trade negotiations and everything, agricultural export restriction was always the top-notch conversation that we always have. So outright exports bans have the most detrimental impact but the magnitude of like the welfare loss caused by the different types of restrictions depends heavily on the price elasticities of demand and supply and all those things. So the recent high prices in world markets for many agricultural commodities have also brought this treatment of export restricting practices back into the trade agreements and back into the spotlight of all this like world trade negotiations. So the WTO and through the GATT articles, the allows the use of these quantitative restrictions for an extent, and all these quantitative restrictions as well as the embargoes on agricultural exports if it's used temporarily to relieve shortages of basic foodstuffs or other materials of importance to the exporting country. So that's the article states. That's why like we see that even when countries like India imposes minimum export prices, it's only for a short period and they remove it and then they introduce it again. So that's how we've been playing with this kind of policy tools, right? And in the Doha round of world trade negotiations also has offered an opportunity to strengthen how we can discipline these export restrictions further. So but there hasn't much output hasn't come out. Only thing is the certain provisions were added to deal largely only with the length of time for which restrictions can be applied. So there's like certain conversation, but it's again it's not fully like good solution. It's just that you can't put these kind of restrictions for a longer period. That's only like outcome from all these negotiations that has come out. But again, it's like widely practiced, but countries like India has been like practicing is it very widely. That's all.
Okay, okay. So I want to understand this, minimum export price better. So this minimum pricing for exports, kinds of put in a price floor, right? Which
Yes.
disturbs the free trade, right? And so, do this disruption really help government to, you know, with its objectives, what it really wants to try to get, and how disincentivize exports, exporters when the prices are lower, right? And provided we, now when the prices are lower and we have minimum export price, now how do and we being the major exporters of many of the essential goods, how do this whole scenario pans out?
Yeah, very interesting question, Avinash. So, if you look at it historically, also India intends to promote its agricultural export in the world market. However, like agricultural products of India have been increasingly restricted for exports due to concerns of the domestic political economy. So, on the one hand, dedicated and detailed, we have agricultural export policy, which indicates our policymakers' enthusiasm and aspiration for like increasing the agricultural export of India. But at the same time, we have uh, policies that curtails with a wavering and unstable trade policy regime that's resorting to export restrictions. So firstly, the use of trade policy instruments like export restrictions is aimed to protect consumers from inflammatory pressures. That's the main objective that say that this is why we're introducing minimum export price, and then to ensure orderly domestic supply and tame speculative tendencies of like stock holding and all these kind of behaviors, and to create greater welfare in the society. That's the stated objective of all these export restrictions policies, right? But in practice, the rationale is far beyond the sphere of economic fundamentals, and it's also aimed at serving the constituents of political economy, because like you see that these kind of things happens when you want have elections. You see that there is like
Mhm.
removal of MEP and all those kind of things, right? So the ostensible reasons for such restrictions are either food security or ensuring regular supplies to domestic industry. So that's a stated intention of this policy. But if you look at MEP, so to I understand MEP better, like the minimum export price is basically one of the many policy tools used to control India's exports of food commodities. So what is
Mhm.
it is basically it is a regulatory threshold set by the government to control the lowest price at which goods can be exported. So, and it is an
Okay.
export control policy tool that the government has been employing to protect consumers from inflammatory pressures and all this kind of things, right? So basically, how it disincentivizes, like, I will come to the details of it, how the demand and supply aspects work out it better. But MEP caps are always like higher than the prevailing prices in the global market, which kind of disincentivize the export of certain products. So MEP is usually used in products like, potatoes and edible oil and all those things. And these products are such typical staple food in India that price fluctuations and food price inflation affect the political climate of India.
Okay. This question just came to my mind. So, if the market price is lower, and if India is the major exporter of one particular essential goods, for example, say basmati rice,
Hmm.
and if it has a minimum export price, which is higher than the market value, do you think the market value would adjust to the MEP? I mean, because India being the highest producer or highest exporter?
Not really. Like, okay, it might affect a few demand and supply issues there, but at the larger scale, India is not the single country that is exporting, right?
Oh.
Although we are like one of the
Hmm, hmm,
exporters
hmm, hmm.
in certain, and also so like our export is quite limited to few countries. It's not like as wide as it. So it has very limited that way, like elasticity when it comes to the supply of it and the
Okay.
price aspect. But if you look at it like in turn how it affects the Indian domestic prices, definitely it has an impact, because like there's like if you look at the demand and supply question and the global prices are increasing, and
Hmm,
also like India being not able to export much, that affects the supply question. So the price is like
hmm.
really high there. And since India is not India also like the global prices impact the domestic prices also, so the domestic prices might shoot up.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. So now, I mean, I think I should take a pause, and we have been talking about MEP, or the minimum export price for essential goods, right? Essential commodities. I think it's a good time to understand what these essential commodities are, right? I mean, that would give a very good idea on what products we are trying to have to, I mean, government of India or union government is putting in MEP. So can you just tell us more about what do these essential commodities are, how they are
So
defined?
yeah, so I'm not getting into the commercial essential commodities act as such, but basically, if you're looking at the minimum export price, so there is no exact like which all the products have been widely used, but it's in India. If you look at it over the years, it's primarily being used for four agricultural products mainly, like onions, potatoes, rice, and edible oil. So so as a use of MEP for export restrictions, onions is the most extensive out of all these products, and sometimes we also use it on
Okay.
rice and oil also, but it's onions is something that we have been seeing it extensively.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's also done it on a very arbitrary basis, like done on a weekly basis. So they'll impose the MEP, lift it after a few weeks. So it's like on a weekly basis, it's like being changed. So MEP caps are imposed by the Directorate General of Foreign Trade, the DGFT, by exercising its power under the Section 5 of the Foreign Trade Act of 1992. So like MEP caps can make certain agricultural product unattractive in the international market. That's the like main aspect here, right? So what it's basically does is like customs, when they export it, the customs does not allow the export clearance of such goods unless like the invoice of these products have of such exportable products is not more than this mandated price, the mandated MEP.
Okay.
So
Hmm.
yeah, so again like it mainly because of the concerns are like the domestic supply concerns and all of these things. So under MEP, an agricultural product cannot be exported below the fixed floor price to an international customer. That's a rule that it states.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So now, as we have talked about, what MEP does, and you know on what product it is being put in, um, so with what are the consequences we see to different stakeholders, right? I mean, we have different farmers, who grow these essential commodities. It could be rice, it could be onions, potatoes, or it could be the global market itself, right? So
Yeah.
what are the unintended consequences we see with these policy in place?
Yeah.
How are these different stakeholders go through, what are the consequences we are looking, we are able to see.
Yeah. So, likely you said, like MEP is like a redundant policy tool that has a lot of unintended consequences. So that kind of continue to impact the food sector trade in India as well as global, right? So, firstly, like if you look at it, firstly, it costs the producers as they lose an opportunity for a remunerative prices and disincentivizes them to produce more. So, like when you open the global markets for the producers, they will have like a lot of opportunities than in domestic environment, right? And a lot of other regulatory mechanism is also there that kind of hampers the producers in disincentivize them to like produce it domestically, like sell it domestically, because like you have a lot of regulatory mechanisms that's like plays in India. So like by limiting the exports also, like completely disincentivize them, and they might get better prices if they sell it outside, I mean export it. So those kind of opportunities are being like denied for the producer here. Second, it disproportionately impacts the small farmers in India, as like large agri firms have means and ways not to be affected by the MEP policy. So one way they can do is like there's an agency commission from buying houses, like when they export it. So there's certain agencies, the agency houses, which like kind of help them to export it and find a importer in the other country and all those things. So they add this cut of the price of the agency commission as well as in the total invoice. So the large firms were able to kind of like bypass this MEP through doing that and everything. But smaller farmers is like disproportionately affected by this policy, because they most of the time they might not be able to do that. And thirdly, MEP, along with other export restrictions, disincentivize most producers to produce more, which affecting the domestic and international supply, while demand continues to sustain. So, on the other hand, if exports were allowed, farmers might be incentivized to produce more. Hence, supply will increase. And as we all know, that if the supply increases, the price will decrease, right? So that's not happening because the supply is being reduced. So the price will be like remaining constant. So fourth aspect, India's employment of like minimum export prices impacts international prices, potentially leading to a surge in global prices of these products, given that India is one of the major exporters of rice and onions in the country. So at the same time, since imports have not been restricted, increased global prices cause an increase in the domestic prices, like I said earlier. So, hence, the minimum export price policy does not help reduce the domestic inflationary trend, which is a very objective the policy was intended to serve. So, that itself has like failed.
Yeah, I mean, based on these arguments, we understand that MEP is a redundant policy, right? And
Yes.
it would be interesting to see the objective which government wants to achieve, right? To control the price or control the supply inside the country when the need arises. So now, as MEP has multiple unintended consequences, and
Yeah.
if on a long run it also counter productive, or it
Yeah.
does what it's not supposed to do, right?
Yes.
So what
Yeah.
do you think could be a better alternative to the MEP? What
Yeah.
can replace MEP in a better way that it works?
Yeah. So, from a pure economic sense, I feel like the minimum export price or any of those kind export restriction policies is kind of not economic friendly, because it's not following the basic demand and supply equation if you're looking at, right? So like the recent decision to remove MEP was a welcome one, but my major suggestion is that do not reintroduce this minimum export prices back, because we have to have a like a conversation and like take a call on this and say that like we do not need this MEP because it's not economically rational, like so while this decision is a welcome one, we also have to ensure that we will refrain from reintroducing these kind of export restriction policies to these kind of products, as agri trade policies are like changed frequently. Also like it's also providing a certain kind of like policy instability as well. So we have to make sure that there is a proper demand and supply market that's been going on and all those things. And we also have to incentivize farmers to produce more and increase India's exports, right? So if you have more produce out there and then you're increasing the exports also, then you don't have to be concerned much about the food security domestically. But again, I have to understand that food security is also one of the concerns for a large country like India. So we also have to take a lot of measures to see that how we can make sure that the production is sustainable, and it's
Mm.
also we are able to sustain from the domestic production and all those things. So one thing we can make sure is that the market has a way of working out its own these kind of problems, but the constant government intervention displays the duality of conflicting policy objectives. The policymakers intervening to protect farmers from price declines with minimum support prices and all those things, and on the other hand, you also have government intervening to protect consumers from price increases with policies such as minimum export price. So this creates a kind of not so optimum equilibrium in the market, and it impacts the demand and supply relations in the market. So the policy's benefits do not outweigh the cost of if you do the cost benefit analysis, the
Mm.
policies so although its intended objective is makes sense, you have to protect the domestic supply and make sure that there is food security and all those things. But if you economically analyze the economic tool, then it's not making much sense, because the unintended consequences kind of outweigh the objectives, right? What is a you're not able to make certain outcome out of it, and the trade is being continuously distorted by these kind of moves. So what we can do is allow exports, which
Mhm.
incentivizes the producers to produce more, and like we mentioned earlier, that stabilize the prices when the global prices are also kind of stabilized. And we also have to look at what are the innovative supply side measure that we can introduce to the agricultural production in India. We can look at what are the maybe there are virtual multilateral grain reserves and all those kind of thing, or how we
Mm.
can look into the agricultural cooperatives raising money on the stock market. These are some random ideas that we can worth exploring. There are a lot of options we can see, how we can ensure that there is a lot of innovative measures that we are taking to improve the production domestically. And efforts should be also made to boost agricultural production, particularly considering in developing countries like India. We have to see how we can augment global food supplies as well. So we have to remove,
Mm.
in if there are any import restrictions, we have to remove the import restrictions, allow food imports to come as well, and then allow the exports as well. I think free trade will solve many of these issues in the market through obtaining a market equilibrium and all those things.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, it's like don't mess with the free trade, but rather work internally to make our supply better and resilient, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's
I think
great. That's
food security is a concern. I'm we am not ignoring that aspect, but is this the policy tool is the right solution? Is the major question that we have to critically ask, because
mm,
personally, I don't think it's a right solution to this problem.
correct. That's great. I mean, it's a really great discussion with you, Anishree. I mean, the insight you have shared with us, help us understand, minimum export price and help us unbundle it. I would say thank you for joining us and helping us understand it better.
Thank you, Avinash. It was a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed it.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.